once I accepted that this is how my brain works, it was not an excuse to not worry about it, because I wanted my house to be under control. I always did. But it was freedom for me to let go of that shame and say, you know what? I just have to figure out what does work for me in my unique home with my unique brain that God created me with, right? And so removing that shame and accepting that I am created the way that God wanted me to be created was so much freedom for me from that shame. So what I learned over the years.
You're listening to Altered Stories with Michelle Renee Gutch.
Happy January, Altered Story Show listeners, and welcome to my Season 4, Episode 149, featuring my special guest here, Dana White, who is sharing her freedom from the shame of a messy house God story. Now, ain't that fine? That is amazing. We're going to hear more. Friends, this is your chief storyteller host, Michelle Saunders Gutch, and thank you for listening and watching my show that helps Christian women share their God stories so women around the world can hear them and never feel alone. If one of my stories I've shared has blessed you, then bless us, friends, by subscribing to the show and sharing the episodes. Or you can purchase a 52-week podcast episode digital devotional or any of our awesome items from our online store from our website. Or you can always donate to the ministry to help another woman like Dana share her God story. And friends, I also hope your 2025 year is going well so far. Don't know if you have a word, don't know where you're at with your resolution, but I'm going to tell you 2025 is going to be epic. And before I start the show, I wanted to express to friends my heartfelt condolences to all our listeners from the LA area who have been impacted by the fires. I've been praying for all of you, including the heroic firefighters. And I have not forgotten about all our North Carolina listeners who have also struggled and are struggling to rebuild to the hurricane impacts. Now, let's get this show started. Thank you so much, Dana. You've been so gracious sitting there. This woman, she is a rock star. And I am so excited to bring her to you. She's very humble, but she is amazing. She's a referral from Front Gate Media. I really want to thank them. They've sent me some incredible guests. She's a decluttering expert. Wow. My daughter is a minimalist, and she loves women like Dana. She's an author, a podcaster with over 17 million downloads on YouTube. She's an empty nester, the creator of the No Mess Decluttering Method, and a former theater arts teacher, and lives in Texas. Welcome to the Altered Story Show, Dana. How are you doing today?
I'm great. Thanks so much for having me on. This is fun.
I just love, to open up with bios. And, obviously you're not the bio. You've got a lot of other things that you do, but it's kind of a combination of all of what you've been doing. But can you share for the audience a fun fact about yourself that I may not have shared?
Fun fact. Well, let's see. You mentioned that I was a theater arts teacher. Did you mention that I'm an empty nester now?
I did. I did.
So it's funny because I was an empty nester for 2 days back in August, because two of my kids left for college, and then the one who was already gone decided he was going to come back home. So we had, 2 days of empty nesting, and then he has decided he's going to move again. So we are back to being empty nesters now. So I think that's it. You know what? You have to consider this phase of life fun, because otherwise it will make you bananas, right? Like it's this, I feel like it's the phase of my life where I get to learn all these exciting, fun things like powerlifting and drill team and fishing and all this stuff that I have no interest in, but I get to learn about it because my kids are into it. So, yeah, I think it's a super fun phase of life.
That's really cool. You know what I've experienced? I'm an empty nester for some time, and now I'm a Gigi, you know?
Fun.
You just kind of evolve, you keep evolving.
Yeah.
But what's really cool is, you know, kids that are transitioning, you know, they are exploring. You know what I'm saying? I mean, they're trying to figure it out. Like several of the family members have come back home. They go to college, they're all excited to go, and then they're lonely or they're homesick or they're struggling. And that's a transition. It's a huge transition. So my daughter did that. She eventually found her wings and finished, and it all worked. But you know what? It is fun. You do have to make it fun,
I
right?
always say, I'm like, it's a good thing I like roller coasters because this phase of life is a roller coaster because you're like, oh, okay, nope, we're gonna go do this. Oh, we're gonna go do this, you know. So I'm along for the ride. I think it's really fun to get to see them turn it into their people with the lives that they want to lead. So it's really fun.
Yeah. Well, that's cool. So, you know, my show is all about helping Christian women share their God stories, their redemptive stories, the part in their life where God came in, there was a change and alteration, that transformation, inner transformation. It really affected so many other areas of their life and brought them into where they're at, their victory story, whatever you want to call it, their testimony. But I would love to hear from you why you think it's important for women to share their stories.
You know, my yes, I'm a decluttering expert, but the reason that I'm able to help people is not just that I know things about decluttering. The reason I'm able to help people is because of my story, right? Like I
Mhm.
get emails from people all the time and they say, you know, whatever changes they've made, but almost every single one says that their pivotal moment was finding out they weren't alone, that they were not the only one who struggles the way that I did when I started down this path, right? And knowing that they aren't broken, that they aren't hopeless, that they aren't the only one is actually the transformational moment for so many people in being able to finally make the progress that they've wanted to make, finally make changes that they've wanted to make simply comes from knowing they're not alone, which therefore means people have to share their story. You know, we have to share our stories so that others know that they're not alone, right? And you know, ironically, maybe I think I'm using that word correctly this time, but I found out that I wasn't alone by sharing my story. It was anonymous in the beginning. I didn't tell anybody what I was doing, but I truly thought I was the only one. And then people started reading what I was writing and saying, me too. And that was transformational for me. And so I also personally understand that power of needing to know that you're not the only one with the experiences or the thoughts or the, you know, struggles that you have.
Yeah, that's really profound. And what you're sharing, you know, is so, I mean, there's such a impact, you know, um, when someone does understand they're not alone, like you're saying. I mean, it was just a pivotal moment, right? And so I always ask my guests because everyone has a different kind of opinion on that, but it seems to have a common thread around no one wants to be alone in their journey, in their struggle.
Yeah.
Now, did you have a story that you listened to in your life that really affected you that, when you were going through what you were going through, in maybe the whole journey of shame recovery? Was there a story that you heard that made an impact on
Um,
you?
I think it was those people reaching out to say, so my story is that I started a blog because I wanted to be a writer, but my
Mm-hmm.
house was a disaster. And so, um, through God's direction, he was like, just write about that. And I was like, oh, okay. So I thought I was going to just write a practice blog, and it was anonymous in the beginning. It was people reaching out and saying, those thoughts are my thoughts. Because I thought when I first started writing that if anybody ever found this, they were going to confirm that these were shameful things that I was sharing, that my struggles in my home and my messy spaces and all that. And instead, people said, yes, I feel the same way. So that was incredibly powerful for me.
Yeah. So let's talk about your story. Let's get into that where you're comfortable, and then we can talk more about the details around, your book. But yeah, talk to us a little bit about where that all began and kind of lead us up to where you are, because obviously you got a lot of healing from that book writing. But tell us, maybe go back, set the stage, talk a little bit about maybe your background, maybe your faith background, where you're comfortable. Can you do that?
Yeah. So I was brought up in a Christian home, and I did not know at the time how thankful I needed to be that, my parents truly looked to scripture, to God for guidance in every area of life, right? Like I didn't know that that's less common than you would think, among Christians, right? So my
Yeah.
parents were very, very passionate, and their faith was very real, right? So I grew up in a home where I was loved. I met Jesus at a very early age, and became a Christian.
Mm-hmm.
Became a went to college. I did missions for 2 years after I graduated from college. Went overseas for a couple years. Got my husband. I got married right after I got back. 20 days after I got back, which is kind of bizarre, but
That's crazy.
I know. We had met. We were part of a group of friends before I left, and we just started dating right before I left. And so we emailed all for 2 years and then got married right when I got back. So, but yeah, so I knew Jesus. I believed. I loved God. I wanted to serve him, but my whole life I was messy. Okay. So I was born messy. I was the kid who struggled in my room, drove my mama crazy. She tried so many different methods of, everything from discipline to reward systems to everything, trying to help me, not be so messy. I was always messy, ruined a bunch of roommates who would say, oh, I'm neat enough for both of us. And I was like, we'll see, I didn't want to be that way, but I would always end up, just every space that I ever lived in was messy. But I thought once I got married that I wouldn't be messy anymore, which doesn't make any sense now to me. But at the time, it made sense because I thought, well, at that point, it's going to matter to me, right? Like before I was married, I, lived my life primarily outside of my home. And so, I was a theater arts teacher and I was working, I was very busy. And that was the reason, right? Like I just haven't focused on it. It just doesn't matter enough to me yet. Once I get married, it'll matter. And then I got married and I still struggled as much as I ever did before. And then I had kids. And I had always assumed, even after I wasn't magically cured by getting married, right? I assumed that once I had kids and I was a stay-at-home mom, which was my dream, then my house would be under control because what else would I have to do? It was just logical to me, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm sure you can guess what happened there. Even people who have been organized their whole life naturally tend to struggle after they have kids, right? And so
Oh, yeah.
I finally got to this point in my life where I realized I have been waiting for this time in life where I feel like at that time, that's when I'm going to get organized, right? Like I'm not going to struggle with this anymore. And then I got there And I was still incredibly messy. And so at that, and I was trying, like it was never an issue of not trying. I tried every system. I tried every way. I did what I thought other people were doing, and it didn't have the same effect on my house. And so I was working hard on it. And I just couldn't seem to do it. At that point, that was when I started to have, I don't want to call it an identity crisis necessarily, but in a way it was like, I was like, wait a minute.
Yeah.
I can't do this thing. And I'd always been very highly successful in school, in work, in anything that I put my mind to, I could figure it out, right? And I could not figure this out. So that was where the shame entered the story for me. It was never something that I was proud of. It was definitely always something I didn't mention to other people, how messy I was. I remember many people seeing my space and going, I never thought you would have a messy space like this. Like they were really surprised by it, right? So but at this point, that was when I felt like there is actually something wrong with me, that this is so hard.
It sounds like you got stuck all of a sudden with shame.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's something wrong with me. Why can't I fix this? I can do everything else.
Well, and it seems like it was something that was easy for everyone else, right? Because when you go into someone's home, they've cleaned up, and I could have people over. I just needed 2 weeks to get ready. That's all. Like I would spend a week shoving everything into the room where I could lock the door. And then I would spend a week cleaning. And so to have people over was this big, exhausting event for me. Right. And then I would get my house perfect, except for all the stuff shoved in that room. And then I would say, okay, I'm just going to keep it this way. Well, we all know how that happens, right? Like I didn't know how to keep it that way. And so it would just go back to being worse than it was before as all that stuff drifted back and things got back out of control. And so I really questioned, what am I missing that other people seem to just naturally know? And I cannot figure out.
Yeah. Well, so, did people try to accuse you of being a hoarder?
No, I was pretty good at hiding things.
Okay.
I would say sometimes people ask you like, how bad was it? And I'll tell them it was the 2 weeks thing, that I needed to let people in. But I also I would move stuff from one room to another. So I usually had a room.
Yeah.
That was a complete disaster. Like things had just been shoved in there. Right. And, sometimes it would be 2 rooms or whatever, because I would declutter that room, but I wasn't actually decluttering. I was just stuff shifting. And so I would move stuff out of that room, but I just knew I wanted to keep it. I didn't have a place for it. And so I would just put it into another room. Well, then that room became the out of control space, and that room became the out of control space. And so it was, it was when you feel like you can't let somebody into your home.
Yeah.
That's very, difficult. And people would try to, my mother was always incredibly helpful, incredibly loving. She would come to my house, after I had kids, she would stay for a couple days and she would get it organized. Well, then I couldn't keep it that way, right? Like I wasn't able to. She would get everything neatly put in all these neat little places. And then it would always fall back into disaster. And so then I got to the point where I didn't even want her to come help me because it felt like it was so completely pointless because I couldn't maintain it. So that just added to this shame cycle that I was experiencing.
Okay. So tell us more. Where did you resolve this shame? How did you learn to bring freedom out of it? I mean, what did you end up doing that? Because here's the thing. We all know people that have clutter around them. They organize differently. They think differently. They learn differently. And then there's people that, just, it's not important. It's, you know what I mean? It's just not important to them. Or then there's people that bring emotional base. Yeah.
I'll push back on the not important thing. And here's the thing is the person who is struggling and who has tried and failed again and again and again, it can appear that it's not important to them. But I'm going to push back and say that for most people, it is important to them. They just literally don't know how to do it. So my story of how this all changed was that I wanted to be a writer. That was my desire. I was a theater arts teacher before I had kids. I had this creative thing in me. I was desperate to write. Well, back in 2008, I discovered blogs, and I was like, I've got to have one. Like I need to have a blog. I want to write this. I felt was something that I knew God was calling me to do. But I wanted to get my house under control first because it was holding me back. And so now I had this motivation other than just doing it for all the reasons of I want my house to be under control. But now I had this motivation that I have this dream to write and I can't do it because my house is a disaster. I've got to get my house under control. So for a year and a half, I was desperately trying. Even though I'd always tried before, I was really desperately trying because I wanted to start my blog. Well, in August of 2009, so about a year and a half later, after I discovered blogs, I was sitting in church and I was not listening to the sermon, I'll just be honest, but I was praying and I was frustrated because the next day, my second child out of 3 was going to start kindergarten. And it felt like the perfect time to start a blog, right? Because I had 3 kids and there was only going to be one at home. And so I wasn't going to have to coordinate nap times anymore and have them overlap, and have a little bit of time to write. I was like, if she goes down for a nap, I could actually write. Like, this is the time. It only makes sense for me to start writing now. But I couldn't because God had not answered my prayer to cure me of this messiness. I had desperately cried out to God, please make me organized. Please remove this messiness from me. Please help me figure this out. And he had not done that. And so I was praying and I was frustrated that God had not answered my prayer. And I said, why have you not taken this away? Because it's keeping me from doing the thing that I feel like you've called me to do in writing. And that's when God said, and I don't say that often. I don't say it, lightly.
Yeah.
But God said, just write about that. And I was like, okay, that's actually a really good idea. Okay. So at that moment, he also gave me the name of my blog, which was A Slob Comes Clean. And I had never called myself a slob before because I worked hard. I was not just okay with it, right?
Yeah, that's a hard word.
I didn't want to call myself that, but I couldn't think of another word. And I wanted to be a writer, but like I was desperate to get home and get this thing started. I thought it was going to be a practice blog. I thought it was going to be temporary. I was going to get my house under control by using this as a way to learn about writing, the thing I wanted to do, and focus on my house, right? Like, so I was going to use that. And then a couple months later, my house would be perfect, right? And then I was going to start writing about the things I felt qualified to write about. And so I did. I started immediately. It was anonymously in the beginning. I did not use my real name. I didn't show my picture. I set up a new email address so no one would ever trace it back to me. I didn't even tell my husband what I was doing, right? Because I had tried so many times to get my house under control that I just assumed this would be another failed thing. And I also was going to share the truth, right? Like by being anonymous and by having called myself a slob, which is a horrible word. I never tell anybody else to call themselves a slob. Like I'm not encouraging you to do that. But because I had used that awful word and because it was anonymous, there was no reason to hide anything, right? Like it made me just be completely and totally honest. In the beginning, no one was reading it anyway, right? Like I was showing actual pictures of this is what my dining room looks like. And then I would work on it and I would show the progress that I made. But I was like, these are the actual pictures, and I would write about and I would try to figure out, why do I resist this thing? Why do I not do this? What is it that makes an impact? What is it that doesn't? So as I worked on my house, I started, having people started reading it, and nobody I knew, of course, but people started reading it and saying, that's my story too. And back in the day in 2009, if you were on Blogspot and somebody would leave a comment, you would click on their name and find out what you could about it. Cause I was so excited that somebody was reading it. Right. And I would find out that these were highly creative, intelligent, successful, artistic women. And I realized, oh, okay. This messiness issue that I have is directly related to my high level of creativity.
Mm.
Therefore, if I'm going to thank God for making me creative, which I do, this is my favorite thing about myself, right? Like, I love doing creative things. If I'm going to thank Him for that, and my brain being creative means I also struggle with the organization of physical stuff,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to thank Him for making me, right? Like, I realize this is part of how my brain works. He designed me with this brain. People who don't struggle with this struggle with something else, but people who don't struggle with this, their brains work very differently from mine. But most of the people who don't struggle with this, they're writing about organizing because they enjoy organizing. And so, because their brains work so differently, because God created them differently, I was lost reading that traditional organizing advice. I was like, you're skipping all this stuff. Like, your before pictures are like my dream after pictures. So I was lost on page 3 and I didn't understand what was going on. But I didn't know that. But once I accepted that this is how my brain works, it was not an excuse to not worry about it, because I wanted my house to be under control. I always did. But it was freedom for me to let go of that shame and say, you know what? I just have to figure out what does work for me in my unique home with my unique brain that God created me with, right? And so, removing that shame and accepting that I am created the way that God wanted me to be created was so much freedom for me from that shame. So what I learned over the course of this, because I was also, getting really involved in Bible study and learning so much more and understanding so much more about the realities of grace. And I was able to see, as I was learning more and more about grace and what that means, and taking away all the pressure, because it's literally nothing I do that gets me closer to God. It is only what Jesus has already done, right? And my faith in what Jesus has done. And
That
so
is so profound.
when I
Amen.
took away this idea
Mhm.
that I was trying to please God from this, and I took that pressure away, God was just showing me again and again, Dana, I never cared about your messy house. I care about your heart. Okay. And just removing that shame gave me the freedom to actually make the progress, right? When I realized what it was that I was doing, cleaning your house is a great thing, right? I feel like I've earned the right to talk about this, because there shouldn't be any misunderstanding that I'm saying, don't worry about your messy house, right? Like, I'm not saying that, but I'm also not saying that because I know that nobody needs to be convinced to get their house under control, right? Like, people want that. The only reason it's not is because they haven't figured it out yet, how to do it. It's not that they don't want it. So I'm not here to convince you to have a messy or clean or whatever house. I'm just saying, I've already written the books about how to get your house under control. Let's talk about where Jesus comes into this, and how the removal of the shame, that Jesus takes that shame away, is the thing that actually frees me to go finally make progress. Not to be like other people and do it their way, but to say, I'm going to do this the way that God created me.
That is huge. It's a huge revelation and breakthrough. That is a huge breakthrough, because there is that spiritual component, the part of the healing piece within ourselves, and the way that we're wired and how we receive our maker, in our faith, that really drives all the other things, like seek ye first the kingdom of God in his righteousness, and all these things will be added unto you. I mean, I think God really blessed you when you started surrendering and being obedient and wanting him to come into your story, and then letting him, through his grace, get you to the place of where you needed to be healthy in the area of how you viewed what your struggle was.
Yeah. Well, and that's the reason my first three books don't have any spiritual content in them. And because a lot of times, especially as a Christian woman, when I had read things written by Christian women, I'm not saying this was their intention, but
Right.
because of my filter of shame,
Yeah.
it felt like, okay, if you add in some spiritual motivation and all this kind of stuff, then I'm taking this thing I already struggled with that I feel like a failure in. And now we've layered on that it's also a spiritual failure. So when I first started, I thought God was going to show me something I was missing. I was like, I have to have missed something about what it means to be a Christian woman, that this is a struggle for me. Like God's going to show me a verse. He's going to reveal a, truth to me through the Bible, and I'll finally get it and it won't be a struggle anymore. And instead God was like, I never cared about your messy house. Cared about your heart. Like, stop thinking that's the thing I'm looking at. And so we have to have that conversation, right? Like we have to have the conversation. People, cleanliness is next to godliness is one of those things that people like to throw out there,
Well,
right?
they do.
Yeah. And it's not in the Bible. But if you Google, is cleanliness next to godliness in the Bible, the answers all say no, but they all give a but, right? Like most of them will give a but. No, it's not in the Bible, but the concept or whatever is this idea that maybe it doesn't say that, but isn't the concept true? And I'm like, no, because you know what gets you to godliness? Nothing but Jesus, right?
Yeah,
And
that is
it,
so true,
and
Dana.
if I think that there
Yeah.
is anything that's going to get me closer to God that I'm doing, then I don't understand how this works, right? Like if I think there's anything I can do to get me to God, then I am missing the point, right?
I
So
agree.
I wanted to tackle in this book, I'm tackling like all these things that we just kind of hear and we just kind of think about. And I think that they don't get discussed because
Yeah.
a lot of us who struggle are scared to discuss it. Like, I can't tell you how many women I know who don't want to read Proverbs 31 because they feel like it will just make them feel guilty because they can't measure up. And I'm like, do you know what's never mentioned in Proverbs 31? Whether her house was clean or organized. Like, it doesn't say a word about that. So I go deeply through that. We talk about what Jesus says about cleanliness. And, I don't know if we want to get into that, but that's one of my favorite things, is when Jesus first really let the religious leaders have it over, focusing on traditions over truth, turning things into spiritual matters that were not spiritual matters. It was over them freaking out over his disciples eating without washing their hands. Well, no one can argue that you should wash your hands before you eat. But Jesus' point is, don't make it a spiritual issue. Like it's really important to have this conversation because when you don't, that's when it starts to, this isn't just a regular struggle. No, it's a spiritual struggle. No, it's a regular struggle. And God's there for all of it. He wants to be part of everything, but you're not failing spiritually because you struggle in this area.
That is the truth. And that is really important because there's a lot of twist around that. There's a lot of people that are out there trying to bring shame, like you said. And
shame
so
is not
this,
motivating. Shame
no,
is not motivating
no,
at all. And it
no.
feels when you're the one, like kind of like we talked about. Well, some people they don't mind it, and I'm like, as the person who struggled, right, and would try to seek out help, I found that a lot of help, people trying to be helpful, were people explaining why I should get my house under control, right? Like
Yeah.
you'll be able to focus more. You'll be able to, whatever, and I would be like, I get why. I just need the how. Please give me the nitty gritty, the how.
So when there are people around you that get comfort with clutter, because I know a lot of people in my family, other people who like clutter around them. They say it just makes them comfortable.
Well, let's say that
Let's
here's what
talk
I'm going to
about
say.
that.
Yeah,
Yeah,
let's talk about it.
I want to talk about it because I'm a clean freak. I'm OCD a little bit. My daughter's, we are master organizers. My daughter is I've never seen a girl who can organize better than my daughter ever. Anyone. I can. I'm sure you can. But I want to talk about that because those of
Yeah.
us that are kind of like OCD and like to control or, what I mean, in that way.
So here's
How do
what I'll
we
say about that.
learn? How do we help?
Yeah. So here's the thing. Clutter is anything that consistently gets out of control. Okay.
Mhm.
So I have a term I call your clutter threshold, which is the
Uh-huh.
amount of stuff that you personally can easily keep under control. Okay. It is not a preference. So while some people might prefer clear spaces and other people might prefer to have all their things on all their shelves,
Yeah.
that's not a clutter thing. Like, let's
Yeah.
don't call that clutter. Let's just call it your aesthetic preference. The issue is when it becomes clutter is when it's piled. You can't find the things that you need. You can't access it. So where it may feel like if you prefer a lot less stuff in your house, it may feel like somebody else's house is cluttered because they have a lot of stuff. But
Yeah.
if they can find what they need, get to it, access it without everything turning into a chaotic pile,
Then that's not
that's not
what
clutter.
you call.
That's
Okay.
just your preference. Okay.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so that is where we just need to go, okay, the issue is when it's out of control. So for me, I had to accept, which I only figured out through decluttering. I was decluttering and decluttering and decluttering and decluttering in my house. And I hit this point where I went, oh, I can do this, right? Like I can handle this amount of stuff. And I realized my mom has a very high clutter threshold. The point
Yeah.
at which she can keep stuff under control is very high. She can have a lot of stuff in her house and keep it neat and all that. It may be more stuff than someone else would prefer, but it stays
Yeah.
under control, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
she's able to do that. I inherited the belief that I needed to have everything I could ever need for any situation that might ever occur in ever. But I did not inherit her clutter threshold. I have a low clutter threshold, which means I like a lot of stuff. I can't have a lot of stuff
Okay.
because I can't control a lot of stuff. If I have more stuff, it gets out of control very easily. Clutter naturally happens to me. So part of the issue is, sometimes somebody from the outside looking in, this is where the whole like naturally organized people versus naturally messy people,
Yeah.
right? The
Yeah,
naturally
yeah.
organized person most likely has to keep things at a minimum because they can't concentrate when there's a whole bunch of stuff, right?
Yes,
And
I think
so-
you're absolutely right.
Right. And so they go into a space where somebody's saying, oh my goodness, I've got piles everywhere and I'm overwhelmed and all that. And they're like, oh, you need to get it cleaned out because you'll be able to concentrate more. And in reality, the reason that stuff got that way is because the person with all the clutter was able to concentrate
Yeah.
and could focus on things, even though things were out of place. And so they were able to focus on. So I say I can't see incremental mess. I see perfectly clean. I see overwhelmingly messy. I don't see what happens in between. So I have the ability to focus in on something while mess is building all around me. And by the time I even notice it, it's already past that point of being completely overwhelming to me, right? And so then I didn't know what to do. So I don't want it to be overwhelming. Now I know what to do. But that person going in and saying, oh, you can't concentrate like this, that doesn't make any sense to the person who's like, I can concentrate. You don't understand what's going on here, right? Like, so the naturally organized person doesn't understand how it got this way. Anybody who says, I don't understand how it gets that way, that's not helpful at all, right? Like, that's not the least bit helpful because this person needs to understand how it got that way. Like, that's actually the core issue, is not just let's get it the way you like it. Let's figure out, how does this happen? How do I prevent this from happening? And how do I dig my way out after it's already happened?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Wow, there's a lot here. There's a lot to unpack. But this is all super, super good to have this conversation, because as we start 2025, everybody is in that mode and they're all trying to, find different things and ways and all of that to start off the new year. And some people want to be minimalist, you know, and that's a big word out there. You hear that a lot, and some people are trying to, I guess, unclutter. But I don't know. They're trying to force themselves some into boxes too. So
Yeah, I think as far as the minimalism goes, I always say people are like, should people will assume that I'm a minimalist because I talk about decluttering, and I'm like, I'm not a minimalist at all. Like what I do is I embrace the reality of my space. And
mhm,
I embrace the reality of my clutter threshold. What can I handle? So I just base things on facts. And therefore, I'm not making arbitrary decisions about what's the least amount of stuff that I can have. Because here's the problem: the person who's completely overwhelmed sees minimalism and is like, oh yeah, that's what I should do. That's what I should do. And so they go, yes, that's going to be my goal. Okay, I'm going to change everything. I'm going to go into my space. And they look around and they're like, well, I can't get rid of that. And they shut down out of overwhelm.
yeah,
Right. And so it's not helpful to go from, a situation that might be borderline or official hoarding and making the goal minimalism. There's so much to go through to ever get to that point that do we even need that to be the goal? My goal, the difference in the goal is I want to make this space better. When I change my goal from I want this space to be perfect to
mhm,
I want this space to be better,
yeah,
there is literally no way to fail at better if I do even one small thing. Okay.
yeah, yeah,
And so that freedom of saying, I'm going to shift my goal that this space is going to be better than it was before. I'm going to remove something, anything that actually let me get started and change, and it ended up changing my home, which was different from all the other times where I was like, I've got to get this space perfect. And then I would never start because the idea of perfect was so far away that it was completely overwhelming.
yeah. What a great solution. So, what I'm hearing from you is that there's a whole lot wrapped up in this, but the key is that you have to work through it, and the techniques and things that you've shared around the spiritual piece, and then stepping away from the bigger picture and just saying, okay, you want to be better, do that. I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth because what you've shared here, there's a whole lot that you've shared, but I'm just trying to wrap us up a little bit.
Yeah.
And, there's your book, obviously, that you've got that I'm sure will also bring tidbits and, um, freedoms from what you've come through and what you're sharing to help those who may be struggling,
Yeah.
is there anything else that you want to share as we wrap up, Dana, maybe about your book or about your journey, or kind of helping
Yeah.
those that are listening?
Yeah. I in my other books, I share my 5-step decluttering process, which is it guarantees progress. I call it the no mess decluttering method because we don't ever pull everything out, right? Like you don't create the bigger mess. That's a lot of people's reason to not declutter because they don't want to do that. Um, so there really is hope. There is an actual process, an actual way to change your home. So go ahead and get started in that. And as you're doing that, the experience of, oh, knowing that there's hope and also removing the shame of this is just a struggle. It's not a spiritual failure. You are not a spiritual failure because your house is messy. That's not what this means. Remove that shame to give you the freedom to say, okay, let's try this method that actually does work for the person who truly struggles. And all those things together, they build on each other. You know what I mean? Like the freedom from
Mm-hmm.
shame makes you able to do the work. The more that you do the work, the more that you start to really see and understand and experience that hope.
Yeah. Well, this is a very complex topic that can be I mean, this is just to me a fantastic way of supporting people who have tried to, I guess, align with, a box label. You know what I'm saying?
Mhm.
Without, them feeling all this cultural, like you said, you've encapsulated that into shame, but that's real. I
Mhm.
mean, and that's real, and that makes people feel less. And we don't want people to feel less. I don't want women to feel less. I mean, many times growing up, when I had my daughter and I was a single mom, her grandmother would say, why do you worry about all this around you? You know, put a place for her to play, get her toys, put her in there, let her, don't be walking around and moving, doing this and doing that and doing that. The purpose here is that you want to be able to spend time with your daughter and quality time. You want her to have a good time. You don't want to be worrying about your home, what it looks like, all that, because that's bringing in things that aren't as important as being with your daughter, spending time with your daughter, letting her play, letting her create. In other words, she was trying to tell me I was stifling her creativity. And I know. And so when she would go over to her house, I mean, she would let her go, pretty much all over the top, level of her home, So I think this is just really great. And it's also good for others like me to understand, you know, that maybe somebody's clutter is okay because they feel like they're in control of their clutter. It's when they don't feel they're in control of their clutter that's where the struggle can be.
Yeah.
So, any other words that you want to share, like where people can get a hold of you? How can they get your books? Those kind of things, because we will have an episode page up there on our website. And we'll have this out there, of course, on all the platforms that people want to listen to podcasts at. We'll be on YouTube. Obviously, there's, some of that you'll be sharing, I know. But, as we wrap up here,
Yeah.
we'd love to learn more about your book,
you.
your books,
Yeah,
those kind of
exactly.
things that can help us.
Yeah. So if you just search Dana K. White, you do have to put the K in there because there is a guy named Dana White that's the head of the Ultimate Fighting Championship, and that's not me.
That's why everyone kept telling me,
Yeah.
Dana.
Yeah,
They're like,
exactly.
I've heard that name.
It's
So
not me. I'm Dana K. White. That's why the K is in there. You can go to aslobcomesclean.com. Search for my books wherever you like to buy books. They're also in most libraries. So, if you don't, I always tell people if your library doesn't have it, ask them for it, and usually you'll be the first one to get it when it comes in. But yeah, so the book is Jesus Doesn't Care About Your Messy House. It's basically a story of God's grace using this oddly specific example to explore what grace actually looks like. So, yeah, I think it's going to be fun to see where that goes. And then Decluttering at the Speed of Life is my book that is probably most well known. That one's done really well, and it has my 5-step decluttering process in it. The mindset shifts on your home to help you make progress. So I'm on YouTube and podcast and newsletter and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah.
wow. Well, I want you to know how much I appreciate you taking the time to come on our show and to
Thanks for having
share
me
these.
on.
It's freedom. It's freedom what you're sharing here. So I love it. Thank you again. And then, friends, now I wanted to take this opportunity to share Sherry Puckett, who is our licensed mental health counselor. And she is going to be talking about a little mental health tidbit for you. So let's take a minute and hear what Sherry has to say.
Hello, friends. This is Sherry Puckett, mental health counselor. And today I want to talk about what are we going to do in this new year, and how are we going to position ourselves to walk a victorious life in 2025 and after? Many times we set ourselves up for failure because we have expectations that, number one, are really not, they just aren't healthy. And then the other thing is that maybe that has nothing to do with God's plan for your life. This is the time when we have all of these New Year's resolutions, and I'm not opposed to that at all, as long as your identity is tied to Jesus and not the resolution. Let me explain a little bit further. Oftentimes we'll say, oh my gosh, I'm going to lose 50 pounds because I want to look exactly like that person there. Or I'm going to be successful and make more money and all of those types of things. Those things in and of themselves are not bad, but they're not your identity, and they're not necessarily what God has for you. The best thing to do is this: walk in the truth that you are God's child and that He loves you deeply. And then pray about it and ask God, what should I do this year? I have a problem with maybe you overeat, or maybe you drink too much. Maybe you do need help with a serious addiction. Those things, yes, we definitely want to be free from those things that are destructive in nature. But as you pursue these transformation or these changes, do not allow shame to cover you if you happen to fall. For example, if you say, okay, I'm going to lose 50 pounds, and then you eat a donut for dinner, right? Maybe that's not the right thing to do, but remember, you're a child of God. That doesn't change who you are, right? You come up with a new strategy, but don't walk outside of identity trying to fulfill a New Year's resolution. And most of all, do not cover yourselves in shame. Shame is not the garment for children of God. Allow yourself some grace and say, God, I know that you can help me with this, and I'm going to do better the next day. Step by step, day by day, you make these changes. Remember this. In Lamentations 3:22, it says, through the Lord's mercies, we are not consumed, because His compassions fail not. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. Every morning. Notice that. Every single morning. So God's mercies are new every morning, and we need to imitate the Father. And that means that we have to have mercy for ourselves and take it one day at a time, one step at a time, and always, always walk in your true identity as daughters of the Most High God. And once you've got that solidified in your heart, then you can do whatever you want to do. And it never phases you, because you are His beloved. All right, I'll see you next time.
And until the next show, friends, be heard and be healed.
Altered Stories Ministry is a faith-based, nonprofit, and women's evangelistic storytelling ministry. If you enjoyed listening to today's story, your family and friends would probably benefit from hearing how God works in the lives of women all over the world, too. So please, subscribe to our show and share the link to this podcast. Share it on your social media. We also welcome your valued feedback on our stories. Also, we'd appreciate your prayerful consideration in sponsoring one of our future God-glorifying stories, and welcome your tax-exempt financial donation. To find out more on how you can support our ministry, you can log on to our website at www.alteredstories.org.